Hello, and welcome to this evening's journey through time. Tonight, we'll unfold another page of history and listen closely to the voices it left behind. Maybe you're lying in bed, phone screen dimmed, or maybe you've simply chosen to let the past keep you company for a while. Where are you joining me from tonight? Leave a comment if you'd like. I always enjoy hearing about your corner of the world and what time it is for you. If you find comfort in slow, thoughtful stories about the people who came before us, I'd be honored if you subscribed. I'm about to take you into the most horrifying living conditions that millions of young men endured during the Great War. We're going deep into the rat-infested hell that was trench warfare, where staying alive meant learning to coexist with creatures that had grown fat and fearless, feeding on human flesh. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some veterans said the rats were worse than the enemy bullets, and you'll discover the shocking lengths these soldiers went to just to survive another day in this underground nightmare. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how bad things really got. When Lieutenant George Coppard first arrived at the Somme in 1916, he thought he was prepared for war. He'd trained for months, learned to march, shoot, and follow orders. Nothing could have prepared him for what he saw when he climbed down into his first trench. The wooden duckboards beneath his feet were slippery with a mixture of mud, blood, and something else he couldn't quite identify. That's when he noticed them. Eyes, hundreds of tiny eyes reflecting the dim light, watching him from every crevice, every sandbag, every corner of what was supposed to be his safe haven. These weren't ordinary rats. 4 years of feeding on an endless supply of corpses had transformed them into something monstrous. They were huge, some nearly the size of rabbits, with thick grey fur and teeth that could gnaw through leather and bone with equal ease. They had no fear of humans anymore. Why would they? Humans had provided them with the greatest feast in their species' history. The Western Front stretched for over 400 miles, from the North Sea to the Swiss border, and every single mile of it was infested. We're talking about trenches that housed millions of soldiers, and rat populations that numbered in the tens of millions. The mathematics of horror are staggering when you really think about it. Each rat could produce up to 50 offspring per year, and with an unlimited food supply courtesy of the constant stream of casualties, their population exploded beyond anything anyone had ever seen. Private Frank Richards of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers kept a diary throughout his service, and his entries paint a picture that's almost too grotesque to believe. On July 15th, 1916, he wrote about waking up to find 3 rats inside his sleeping bag, one of which had made a nest using threads pulled from his uniform. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that he'd grown so accustomed to their presence that he'd actually slept through them moving around on top of him. The rats learned to read the rhythms of trench life better than some of the soldiers did. They knew when the food rations arrived, when the men would be sleeping, and most disturbingly, when someone was about to die. Wounded soldiers lying in no man's land often reported feeling tiny feet running across their bodies as rats investigated whether they were dead yet. Some men claimed the rats could smell death approaching and would gather around dying soldiers hours before they actually passed away. Captain Robert Graves described an incident that haunts me every time I think about it. During a particularly brutal bombardment near Mametz Wood, his unit was trapped in a collapsed section of trench for 18 hours. When the shelling finally stopped and rescue arrived, they found that rats had already begun eating the faces of 2 soldiers who had been killed in the initial blast. The rats hadn't even waited for the bombardment to end. They'd simply adapted to eating during explosions. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. The soldiers couldn't just ignore these creatures. The rats weren't content to simply coexist. They were aggressive, territorial, and hungry for more than just scraps. They would attack sleeping men, chewing through their clothing to get to food stored in pockets. They'd contaminate water supplies, spoil rations, and spread diseases that killed more soldiers than some battles did. The men developed techniques for rat hunting that were as varied as they were desperate. Some used bayonets, Others fashioned crude clubs from broken wooden planks. The most successful rat hunters learned to think like their prey, setting traps using precious food as bait. But for every rat they killed, 10 more seemed to take its place. Sergeant William Pressey of the Sherwood Foresters became something of a legend in his battalion for his rat-killing abilities. He'd developed a technique using a modified entrenching tool that could take out multiple rats with a single swing. His record was 43 rats killed in a single night shift. But even Pressey admitted that his efforts barely made a dent in the population. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. The psychological impact was perhaps worse than the physical threat. Imagine trying to write a letter home to your mother while rats scurry across the paper. Picture attempting to eat your meager rations while knowing that every crumb that falls will attract a dozen hungry creatures that have grown fat on your dead comrades. Think about the sound of hundreds of tiny claws scratching against wood and metal throughout the night. A constant reminder that you're surrounded by creatures that see you as nothing more than their next meal. Some soldiers broke under the strain. There are documented cases of men refusing to enter certain sections of trench because the rat population had grown so dense that the floor literally moved with their bodies. Others developed obsessive behaviors, spending hours each day hunting rats with a single-minded determination that worried their officers more than enemy fire did. The rats affected every aspect of trench life, but nowhere was their impact more devastating than on the already limited food supplies. Rations were scarce enough without having to share them with millions of uninvited dinner guests. The standard British ration was already insufficient to maintain a healthy weight under the physical demands of trench warfare. When rats got into the food stores, which happened constantly, soldiers faced the choice between eating contaminated food or going hungry. Lieutenant James McConnell wrote to his sister about discovering an entire week's worth of bread rations destroyed by rats in a single night. The creatures had somehow gotten into what the soldiers thought was a secure storage area and had not only eaten the bread, but had urinated and defecated throughout the remaining supplies, making everything inedible. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was the difference between having enough strength to fight and slowly starving to death in a muddy hole. The contamination problem extended far beyond just eating the food. Rats carried diseases that were perfectly adapted to the conditions of trench warfare. Weil's disease, spread through rat urine, could kill a healthy soldier in days. Rat bite fever caused infections that would fester in the unsanitary conditions of the trenches. Typhus, carried by the fleas that lived on the rats, swept through entire units, killing men who had survived months of artillery bombardments and gas attacks. Private Tommy Atkins of the Manchester Regiment described the morning ritual that every soldier learned to perform. Before putting on any piece of clothing, you had to shake it vigorously and inspect every fold and pocket, not for enemy snipers or hidden weapons, but for rats that might have made themselves comfortable during the night. He wrote about finding a family of baby rats that had been born in his spare socks. Tiny pink creatures, no bigger than his thumb, that he couldn't bring himself to kill. The rats had no respect for rank or nationality. They treated generals and privates with equal disdain, German and British soldiers as identical sources of sustenance. Corporal Heinrich Müller of the Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment wrote in a letter that was intercepted and later translated by British intelligence about his horror at discovering rats had eaten through his officer's leather boots while the man was still wearing them during a 3-day bombardment. The officer had been so exhausted and shell-shocked that he hadn't even noticed until he tried to stand and found his feet bleeding through holes the size of coins. These creatures had developed hunting strategies that would have impressed military tacticians. They worked in coordinated groups, with some rats creating diversions, while others raided food supplies. Soldiers reported seeing rats forming actual chains to pass food items from hard-to-reach places back to their nests. They had learned to associate the sound of incoming artillery with opportunities for fresh meat, emerging from their hiding places within minutes of a bombardment to feast on the newly dead before burial details could retrieve the bodies. The trenches themselves had become a rat metropolis spanning hundreds of miles. These weren't just random burrows scattered throughout the battlefield. The rats had constructed an elaborate underground network that paralleled the human trench system. Their tunnels connected shell holes, ammunition dumps, command posts, and field hospitals. In some sections, soldiers reported that the rat tunnels were so extensive that entire portions of trench walls would collapse when the weight above became too great for the hollowed-out earth to support. Captain William Orpen, serving with the Royal Engineers, made detailed sketches of rat architecture that he encountered while inspecting damaged fortifications. He documented elaborate nest chambers that could house dozens of rats, complete with separate areas for food storage, nurseries for young, and even what appeared to be communal gathering spaces. The rats had essentially built their own cities beneath the human cities of death, creating a parallel civilization that thrived while the human world above tore itself apart. The smell was something that haunted veterans for the rest of their lives. It wasn't just the stench of decomposing flesh that permeated everything in the trenches. The rats added their own particular bouquet of urine, feces, and musk that mixed with the rotting corpses, stagnant water, and chemical residue from gas attacks to create an atmosphere so toxic that some men vomited continuously for their first weeks in the line. Private Bernard Adams of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers described the morning when his unit discovered what they called a rat graveyard. In a shell crater that had filled with rainwater, hundreds of rat corpses floated in various stages of decomposition. The smell was so overwhelming that grown men, hardened by months of warfare, were reduced to tears. But what disturbed Adams most wasn't the dead rats. It was the living ones that continued to swim through the putrid water, completely unbothered by their deceased companions, still searching for scraps of food. Sleep became a luxury that few could afford, not just because of enemy attacks or artillery bombardments, but because of the constant activity of their rodent roommates. The rats were most active during the hours when soldiers desperately needed rest. They would run across sleeping men's faces, investigate pockets for food, and make scratching noises in the walls that could be heard above the sound of distant gunfire. Sergeant Major Douglas Haig Morrison kept meticulous records of his men's sleep patterns and noticed a direct correlation between rat activity and combat effectiveness. Units stationed in heavily infested sections of trench showed significantly higher rates of what we would now recognize as combat fatigue, nervous breakdowns, and what the military termed cowardice. Men who hadn't slept properly in weeks made mistakes that cost lives. They fell asleep on watch duty, misidentified targets, and failed to properly maintain their weapons. The rats had no understanding of military strategy, but they affected the course of battles in ways that generals never considered. During the Battle of Passchendaele, entire communications networks were disrupted when rats chewed through telegraph cables. Important messages never reached their destinations because the creatures had mistaken copper wiring for food. Artillery coordinates were lost, reinforcement requests went unheard, and tactical advantages were squandered because rats had literally eaten the army's ability to communicate. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Maxwell documented an incident where rats had contaminated an entire battalion's water supply by drowning in the storage tanks and decomposing. The resulting dysentery outbreak was so severe that the unit had to be withdrawn from the line just as they were preparing for a major offensive. The Germans advanced into positions that should have been defended simply because the defending troops were too sick from rat-borne illness to fight. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of life with the rats was how quickly human beings adapted to the unthinkable. Men who had been raised in civilized homes with proper sanitation and regular meals learned to eat food that rats had partially consumed. They slept in beds made from corpses that rats used as highways. They drank water that tasted of rat urine because clean water was a luxury they couldn't afford. Private George Ashurst of the Lancashire Fusiliers wrote about the morning he woke up to find a rat sleeping in his helmet, curled up like a house cat. His first instinct wasn't disgust or horror. It was relief that the creature wasn't dead, because a dead rat in his helmet would have meant throwing away one of his most essential pieces of equipment. He carefully removed the sleeping animal and went about his morning routine as if sharing his sleeping space with vermin was the most natural thing in the world. The transformation of these soldiers' relationship with basic human dignity happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. First, they learned to ignore rats running across their food while they ate. Then, they stopped bothering to clean rat droppings from their sleeping areas. Eventually, some men reached a point where they could sleep peacefully while rats nested in their clothing, their minds having simply accepted this nightmare as normal life. Dr. Harvey Cushing, an American surgeon who worked in field hospitals behind the lines, observed that soldiers arriving from rat-infested trenches displayed symptoms similar to what modern psychology would recognize as severe trauma. They flinched at sudden movements, even when those movements were caused by medical staff trying to help them. They hoarded food obsessively, hiding pieces of bread in their bandages and becoming violent when nurses tried to remove the rotting scraps. Most disturbing of all, many of these men continued to brush imaginary rats off their bodies long after they had been evacuated to clean hospital environments. The rats changed the very nature of death in the trenches. In previous wars, fallen soldiers could expect their bodies to remain intact until burial details retrieved them. In the Great War, death meant becoming food for creatures that showed no reverence for human sacrifice. Families at home had no idea that their sons' bodies might be partially consumed by rats before proper burial could take place. The romantic notions of dying gloriously for king and country became harder to maintain when death meant being eaten by vermin in a muddy ditch. Some soldiers developed superstitions around the rats that bordered on religious belief. They convinced themselves that certain rats were good luck charms, that feeding particular animals would protect them from enemy fire. Others believed that killing rats would bring bad fortune, that the creatures were somehow connected to their own survival. These beliefs weren't based in reality, but they provided psychological comfort in a situation where rational thought offered no hope at all. The rats had become such an integral part of trench warfare that military manuals began including sections on rodent control, alongside instructions for operating machine guns and throwing grenades. Official army publications discussed rat hunting techniques with the same technical precision they used for describing artillery tactics. The British War Office issued pamphlets titled Trench Sanitation and Pest Control that read like horror stories disguised as military doctrine. Even the most hardened officers struggled to maintain military discipline when faced with the daily horror of rat encounters that defied every principle of civilized warfare they had been taught. Colonel Reginald Pemberton of the Gloucestershire Regiment found himself issuing orders that would have seemed absurd in peacetime, but were matters of life and death in the trenches. Men were forbidden from sleeping without their boots on because rats had learned that human feet were particularly vulnerable targets. Soldiers were required to eat their rations in shifts, with some men standing guard not against German snipers, but against coordinated rat attacks on their meager food supplies. The creatures had developed an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural to the exhausted, malnourished soldiers who faced them daily. They learned to time their raids perfectly, emerging from their holes the moment artillery barrages ended, when the men were too stunned and deafened to react quickly. Corporal James MacDonald of the Scottish Rifles wrote about rats that had figured out how to open the latches on ammunition boxes, not for the bullets inside, but for the small pieces of paper and cloth used as packing material that they incorporated into their nests. What made the situation even more unbearable was the complete futility of fighting back. Every method the soldiers tried to control the rat population failed spectacularly. Poison was useless because the rats had access to so much fresh food that they simply ignored contaminated bait. Traps caught a few individuals but made no impact on the overall population. Some units tried flooding sections of trench to drown out rat colonies, only to discover that the creatures were excellent swimmers who simply relocated to higher ground. Private Arthur Pearson of the Devonshire Regiment became obsessed with documenting rat behaviour, filling notebook after notebook with observations that read like the field notes of a demented naturalist. He recorded how rats would post sentries while others fed, how they communicated danger through a complex system of squeaks and clicks, and how they had learned to mimic the sounds of wounded soldiers to lure rescuers into areas where they could scavenge from medical supplies. The psychological warfare these creatures waged was more effective than anything the German army had devised. They attacked when men were most vulnerable, crawling into sleeping bags to gnaw on fingers and toes, chewing through the straps of gas masks while soldiers slept, leaving them defenseless against chemical attacks. They seemed to understand that destroying a man's equipment was more effective than simply stealing his food, because equipment couldn't be replaced in the trenches. Lieutenant Michael Thornton kept a detailed account of what he called the Great Rat War of Hill 60, where his company spent 3 weeks in positions so heavily infested that the wooden duckboards sagged under the weight of rat colonies living beneath them. The men could hear constant scratching and chittering coming from below their feet, a sound that never stopped, day or night. When they finally attempted to clear out the infestation by tearing up sections of flooring, they discovered rat cities that stretched for hundreds of yards underground, complete with storage chambers packed with stolen rations, bits of uniform, and unidentifiable organic matter. The rats showed no fear of the weapons that terrified human beings. They scurried between the legs of soldiers during firefights, completely indifferent to the bullets whistling overhead. They nested inside the barrels of unused rifles, turning deadly weapons into rodent nurseries. Some rats had grown so bold that they would steal food directly from soldiers' hands while they were eating, grabbing mouthfuls of bread or meat and disappearing into holes before the startled men could react. Captain Edgar Williams documented an incident that perfectly captured the surreal horror of trench life. During a dawn raid preparation, his men discovered that rats had chewed through the fuses of several grenades stored in their dugout. The creatures had apparently been attracted to the waxy coating on the fuse material and had rendered an entire cache of explosives useless just hours before a critical attack. The raid had to be postponed while replacement grenades were brought up from the rear, giving the Germans additional time to reinforce their positions. The medical implications of living in such close proximity to these disease-carrying creatures were catastrophic. Field hospitals reported treating more soldiers for rat-related injuries and illnesses than for some types of combat wounds. Rat bites became infected in the filthy conditions of the trenches, leading to gangrene that required amputation. The creature's saliva contained bacteria that thrived in the anaerobic environment of deep wounds, causing infections that resisted all available treatments. Dr. Margaret Anderson, one of the few female medical officers allowed near the front lines, wrote extensively about the unique challenges of treating soldiers who had been living with rats for months. These men arrived at her aid station with a particular type of nervous condition she had never encountered in medical school. They would scratch constantly at imaginary rats crawling on their skin, even while under anesthesia during surgery. Some patients became violent when medical staff approached them with quick movements, their minds unable to distinguish between helpful nurses and attacking rodents. The rats had learned to exploit human weakness with an efficiency that would have impressed military strategists. They targeted soldiers who were already wounded or sick, sensing vulnerability the way predators identify weak prey. Men lying in field hospitals reported feeling tiny teeth testing their bandages throughout the night, rats determining whether the wounded flesh beneath was ready for consumption. Some soldiers became so paranoid about rat attacks that they refused medical treatment, preferring to endure untreated wounds rather than lie still long enough for the creatures to investigate them. Sergeant William Henley of the Yorkshire Light Infantry described the morning ritual that had become second nature to every trench soldier. Before putting on any piece of equipment, every item had to be thoroughly inspected and shaken out. Helmets could contain anything from a single rat to an entire family of the creatures. Gas mask containers were popular nesting sites because they provided protection from the elements. Even weapons had to be checked because rats would crawl inside rifle barrels, seeking warmth and shelter. The creatures affected military operations in ways that no pre-war planning had anticipated. Communications trenches became highways for rat migration, with entire colonies moving from sector to sector following food sources or fleeing from artillery bombardments. Telephone lines were regularly destroyed by rats who seemed to find the rubber coating on cables irresistibly attractive. Important tactical communications were lost because rats had decided that telephone wire made excellent nesting material. Private Thomas Fletcher of the Border Regiment wrote about discovering a rat nest built entirely from military decorations and insignia that the creatures had stolen from dead soldiers. Brass buttons, fabric ribbons, and metal badges had been woven together into an elaborate structure that housed dozens of rats. The sight of vermin living in a nest made from the symbols of human courage and sacrifice broke something inside Fletcher that never fully healed. The rats learned to associate certain sounds with feeding opportunities in ways that demonstrated an almost human understanding of cause and effect. The whistle of incoming shells no longer sent them scurrying for cover. Instead, it brought them rushing toward the impact zones, where they knew fresh casualties would provide new feeding opportunities. Soldiers reported seeing streams of rats flowing toward areas under bombardment, moving against the tide of fleeing humans with a purposefulness that seemed almost intelligent. Some units developed elaborate systems for protecting their food supplies that resembled medieval fortress defenses more than military storage procedures. Rations were suspended from the ceiling in metal containers, surrounded by moats of water, and guarded around the clock by soldiers whose primary duty was rat prevention rather than enemy observation. These precautions succeeded only in slowing down the inevitable theft and contamination of precious food supplies. The smell of rat urine became so pervasive in some sections of trench that soldiers lost their sense of smell entirely, their nasal passages damaged by constant exposure to ammonia-rich air. This created additional dangers because men could no longer detect gas attacks or identify the smell of decomposing bodies that might indicate the presence of disease. Their chemical sensors, evolved over millions of years to protect them from environmental hazards, were destroyed by prolonged exposure to rat waste. Lance Corporal David Morrison kept detailed records of rat-related casualties in his battalion and discovered patterns that horrified his commanding officers. Soldiers who had been in rat-infested trenches for more than 3 months showed significantly higher rates of mental breakdown, regardless of their exposure to enemy fire. The constant stress of sharing living space with aggressive vermin was breaking men's minds more effectively than artillery bombardments or gas attacks. The rats had no respect for the dead, treating human corpses as nothing more than convenient food sources and construction materials. Bodies that couldn't be immediately retrieved from no man's land were stripped of flesh with mechanical efficiency that left only skeletons wearing tattered uniforms. Some soldiers reported finding rat nests built inside the rib cages of fallen comrades, tiny creatures living where human hearts had once beaten. Captain Robert Fitzgerald documented the complete breakdown of normal human behavior among his men after 6 months in heavily infested positions. Soldiers who had once been model citizens were eating partially consumed food without bothering to remove rat bite marks. They slept peacefully while rats ran across their faces, their exhausted minds no longer capable of distinguishing between acceptable and horrific living conditions. The transformation from civilized human beings to creatures barely distinguishable from the rats themselves happened gradually, but inevitably. The winter months brought new horrors as rats sought warmth in increasingly desperate ways. They burrowed into clothing while soldiers wore it, chewing through fabric to create nests against human skin. Men woke up to find rats hibernating inside their uniforms, tiny bodies pressed against their flesh for warmth. The creatures had learned that human body heat was the most reliable source of warmth in the frozen hell of winter trenches. Some soldiers developed a form of Stockholm syndrome toward their rodent tormentors, naming individual rats and treating them almost like pets. Private Kenneth Walsh of the Irish Guards wrote about a particularly large rat he called General Von Whiskers, who had made a nest in his ammunition pouch and whom Walsh fed scraps from his own meagre rations. The relationship provided psychological comfort, even as it demonstrated how completely the war had destroyed normal human responses to threat and disgust. The rats showed remarkable adaptability to military technology, learning to avoid newly installed defensive measures within days of their implementation. Electrified barriers designed to keep them away from food stores were quickly circumvented as the creatures learned to jump over or tunnel under the charged wires. They seemed to possess a collective intelligence that allowed them to share survival information across their entire population. Field reports from sector commanders reveal the complete failure of military hierarchy when faced with the rat problem. Officers who could maintain discipline under enemy fire found themselves helpless against creatures that showed no respect for rank or authority. Generals issued increasingly desperate orders about rat control that were impossible to implement with available resources and manpower. The psychological impact of constant rat exposure created a new category of war trauma that military psychiatrists struggled to understand and treat. Soldiers evacuated from rat-infested positions continued to exhibit rat-related behaviors long after reaching clean environments. They hoarded food obsessively, flinched at small movements, and maintained hypervigilance against threats that no longer existed. Their minds had been fundamentally altered by months of coexistence with creatures that represented everything civilized humanity feared about the natural world. The transformation wasn't just physical. These men were losing pieces of their humanity with each passing day, and the rats seemed to sense this vulnerability, like sharks smelling blood in the water. They grew bolder, more aggressive, treating the soldiers not as threats to be avoided, but as fellow inhabitants of this underground kingdom of death. Private Edmund Clark of the Northumberland Fusiliers wrote about a rat that had taken in his final letter home at residence in his helmet. He'd named it Winston, and had grown so attached to the creature that he couldn't bring himself to remove it. Winston would peek out during morning inspections, his whiskers twitching as officers walked past. Clark fed the rat crumbs from his hardtack biscuits and found comfort in having a living companion that wasn't trying to kill him. When Clark was killed by a sniper's bullet 3 days later, soldiers found Winston still nested in his helmet, refusing to leave even as burial details prepared the body. The rum rations that were supposed to provide liquid courage before attacks became another battlefield in the war against the rats. These creatures had developed a taste for alcohol that rivaled any seasoned drinker. They would gnaw through cork stoppers and wooden casks with methodical precision, getting drunk on the precious spirits that men desperately needed to face the horror of going over the top. Sergeant Major Phillips discovered his entire unit's rum supply contaminated by a family of rats who had apparently been living inside the storage barrel for weeks, their droppings mixed with the alcohol in a putrid soup that made even hardened soldiers vomit. But it was the sound that broke most men eventually. Not the rats themselves, but the silence that followed their sudden absence. When artillery bombardments were particularly intense, even the rats would temporarily evacuate certain sections of trench. The complete quiet that followed was more unnerving than their constant scratching and chittering. Soldiers had grown so accustomed to the background noise of rodent activity that silence felt like death itself. Men would actually call out for the rats to return, unable to bear the unnatural quiet that suggested something even worse was coming. Captain William Hendricks documented what he called the rat madness that affected his company during the spring offensive of 1917. Men began talking to rats as if they were human companions, holding conversations with creatures that showed no sign of understanding. Some soldiers insisted that certain rats were actually the reincarnated spirits of dead comrades, returning to watch over them. Others became convinced that the rats were German spies, carrying information back to enemy lines. The line between reality and delusion blurred until even Hendricks found himself wondering if the rat's behavior was somehow too intelligent to be natural. The creatures had learned to time their activities around human schedules with precision that would have impressed clockmakers. They knew exactly when the evening rum ration would be distributed and would position themselves near storage areas minutes before the appointed time. They understood that morning stand to meant soldiers would be distracted by scanning no man's land, providing perfect opportunities for food raids. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to know when attacks were planned, disappearing hours before assaults began, as if they could sense the impending violence. Lieutenant Charles Pembroke of the Welsh Guards became obsessed with studying rat intelligence after witnessing what he described as a coordinated rescue operation. A rat caught in a makeshift trap had been freed by 3 others working together, one gnawing through the rope while the other 2 pulled the trapped animal to safety. Pembroke spent weeks documenting similar incidents, filling notebooks with observations of rats displaying problem-solving abilities that challenged everything he thought he knew about animal behavior. The winter of 1917 brought a new horror that even veteran soldiers hadn't anticipated. Rats began freezing to death in unprecedented numbers, their corpses creating additional health hazards in trenches already overwhelmed by human casualties. But the living rats adapted by seeking warmth inside soldiers' clothing while they slept, burrowing against human flesh with a desperation that matched their hosts' own struggle for survival. Men woke up with rat-shaped lumps moving beneath their shirts, tiny hearts beating against their skin in a grotesque parody of intimacy. Private George Whitman of the Canadian Corps wrote about the morning he discovered a rat had given birth inside his gas mask bag during the night. The tiny pink babies, no bigger than his thumb, were nestled among the rubber and canvas that was supposed to save his life in chemical attacks. He couldn't bring himself to kill them, but wearing a gas mask that smelled of rat birth fluids during the next chlorine attack nearly cost him his life. The choice between humanity and survival became increasingly impossible to navigate. The rats affected supply lines in ways that generals back in comfortable headquarters never fully grasped. Entire shipments of medical supplies were destroyed, not by enemy action, but by rodent infestations that contaminated bandages, surgical instruments, and medicines. Field hospitals reported shortages of critical supplies, not because of transportation problems, but because rats had rendered everything unusable through contamination. Wounded soldiers died from infections that could have been prevented if clean medical supplies had been available. Documented the complete collapse of sanitation in his sector during the autumn Corporal Timothy O'Brien of the Irish Regiment of 1917. Latrines became feeding grounds for rat colonies so large that using the facilities required armed guards to keep the creatures at bay. Soldiers began defecating in their own trenches rather than risk attacks from aggressive rats who had claimed the designated areas as their territory. The resulting health crisis killed more men than enemy artillery in some units. The psychological warfare these creatures conducted was more sophisticated than anything human strategists had devised. They learned to target soldiers who showed signs of breaking down, somehow sensing weakness and vulnerability. Men who were already struggling with shell shock found themselves specifically targeted by rats who seemed to understand that these individuals were less capable of defending themselves. The creatures would focus their attention on the mentally wounded, adding another layer of torment to minds already stretched beyond their breaking point. Dr. Harold Whitfield, a psychiatrist working with combat casualties, identified what he termed rat persecution complex among soldiers evacuated from heavily infested positions. These men believed that rats were following them even after they'd been moved to clean hospitals miles from the front. They would scratch at imaginary bites, claim to hear rat sounds in sterile medical environments, and refuse to eat food that hadn't been inspected multiple times for contamination. Some patients never recovered from the psychological damage inflicted by months of cohabitation with aggressive vermin. The rats learned to exploit the military's own systems against it. Communication trenches designed to allow safe movement of troops became superhighways for rat migration. The creatures would follow human traffic patterns, learning which routes were safest and most likely to provide feeding opportunities. They established colonies at junction points where multiple trenches met, turning strategic military positions into rodent capitals that were impossible to clear. Sergeant William Crawford of the Black Watch kept meticulous records of what he called the rat census, attempting to track population changes in his sector over time. His notebooks reveal population explosions that coincided with major battles, as increased casualties provided more food sources for breeding rats. After the Battle of Messines, Crawford estimated that the rat population in his area had tripled within 2 weeks, reaching densities that made normal military operations nearly impossible. The creatures showed remarkable adaptability to chemical warfare, developing apparent immunity to chlorine gas that killed humans. Soldiers reported seeing rats moving freely through areas still contaminated with poison gas, apparently unaffected by chemicals that would kill a man in minutes. Some rats seemed to actively seek out gas-contaminated areas, possibly because the chemicals drove away human competitors for food sources. Private Marcus Thompson of the South African Infantry wrote about rats that had learned to mimic human distress calls. These creatures would produce sounds remarkably similar to wounded soldiers calling for help, luring rescue parties into areas where they could scavenge from medical supplies. The psychological impact of being deceived by animals using the voices of dying comrades pushed some soldiers beyond the edge of sanity. The winter brought new horrors as desperate rats began attacking living humans with increasing frequency. Sentries on night watch reported being bitten by rats, attempting to gnaw through their boots to reach warm feet. The creatures had grown so bold that they would attack soldiers who were awake and alert, no longer limiting themselves to sleeping or wounded targets. Some units posted guards specifically to watch for rat attacks, turning precious human resources away from enemy observation to vermin defense. Lieutenant Robert Ashford documented the complete breakdown of military discipline when his company discovered that rats had eaten their way through an ammunition dump, contaminating thousands of rounds with their waste. The bullets were still functional, but covered in rat droppings that made loading weapons a nauseating experience. Orders came down from headquarters to use the contaminated ammunition anyway, as replacement supplies weren't available. Men went into battle firing bullets that had been defecated on by the same creatures that ate their dead comrades. The rats developed territorial behavior that mirrored human military organization. Different sections of trench became dominated by different rat colonies that would fight vicious battles against each other for control of prime feeding areas. Soldiers reported watching rat wars that lasted for days, with hundreds of creatures engaged in combat that was every bit as brutal as the human conflict raging above them. Some men began betting on the outcomes of these battles, finding dark entertainment in violence that didn't directly threaten their own lives. Captain Michael Henderson wrote about the morning his unit discovered what they initially thought was a German booby trap, but turned out to be an elaborate rat construction project. The creatures had somehow moved dozens of unexploded grenades into a shell crater, arranging them in patterns that suggested either intelligence or pure coincidence. Henderson's men spent hours carefully removing the explosives, while rats watched from nearby holes, chittering in what sounded disturbingly like laughter. The medical challenges posed by constant rat exposure went far beyond simple bites and contamination. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, working in a casualty clearing station, documented cases of soldiers whose immune systems had been completely overwhelmed by constant exposure to rat-borne pathogens. These men arrived at her facility with symptoms that didn't match any known diseases, their bodies fighting infections that medical science couldn't identify or treat. Some appeared to be developing immunity to certain rat-borne illnesses, while becoming vulnerable to diseases that normally pose no threat to healthy adults. The creatures affected every aspect of military communication, learning to associate certain activities with opportunities for food or nesting materials. Telegraph operators reported rats chewing through cables with timing that seemed deliberate, cutting communications just as important messages were being transmitted. Some soldiers became convinced that the rats were working for the enemy, though the creatures showed equal disregard for German communications equipment. Private Albert Richardson of the Leicestershire Regiment wrote his final diary entry about a rat that had made a nest inside a dead German soldier's helmet. The creature had dragged bits of uniform, equipment, and unidentifiable organic matter into the steel bowl, creating a monument to death that somehow seemed more obscene than the corpse itself. Richardson found himself unable to remove either the rat or its nest, paralyzed by the sight of a creature living comfortably in a space where human thoughts had once existed. The psychological impact of watching rats consume human flesh while still fresh created trauma that lasted decades after the war ended. Veterans would wake up screaming about rats eating their faces, nightmares that continued into old age. Some men never ate meat again after watching rats tear flesh from recently killed soldiers, their minds unable to separate human tissue from any other protein source. Sergeant David Miller documented what he called the Great Rat Migration of Hill 70, when an entire ecosystem of millions of rats moved from sector to sector following the retreat of German forces. The creatures flowed like a living river through abandoned trenches, carrying diseases, contamination, and psychological terror to previously clean areas. Miller's unit watched helplessly as their relatively rat-free position was overwhelmed by the massive migration, turning their secure dugouts into breeding grounds for vermin within hours. The rats learned to exploit human compassion as effectively as they exploited human weakness. Wounded soldiers lying in no man's land reported rats approaching them with behavior that seemed almost sympathetic, nuzzling against injured men as if offering comfort. Only later would the soldiers realize that the creatures were actually testing them for signs of life, determining whether they were ready for consumption. This perversion of natural mammalian bonding behavior added another layer of psychological horror to an already unbearable situation. Captain Edward Thornfield wrote about soldiers who had stopped maintaining basic hygiene because rats would attack anyone who smelled different from the general stench of the trenches. Men who washed themselves or changed clothes became targets for increased rat attention, as the creatures were attracted to any change in the familiar odors of their shared environment. Cleanliness, one of the fundamental aspects of civilized behavior, became a liability that could cost a man his life. The creatures developed hunting strategies that demonstrated forward planning and group coordination that challenged scientific understanding of rodent intelligence. They would stage elaborate diversions, with some rats creating disturbances in one area while others raided food supplies in another location. Soldiers reported seeing rats posting sentries while others fed, and rotating guard duties with military precision that seemed to mock human organizational efforts. Private Jonathan Mills of the Australian Light Horse wrote about discovering a rat nursery built entirely from human hair that the creatures had somehow collected from dead soldiers. Hundreds of tiny pink babies nested in a bed made from the last earthly remains of men who had died thousands of miles from home. The sight broke something fundamental in Mill's understanding of death and dignity, leaving him unable to face the possibility of his own demise in such surroundings. The winter cold that killed humans also killed rats, but in numbers so vast that their corpses created new health hazards. Frozen rat bodies littered trenches like grey snow, and when the spring thaw came, the decomposing mass of rodent flesh added new dimensions to the already overwhelming stench of death. Some areas became uninhabitable, not because of enemy action, but because the smell of rotting rats was so intense that it caused immediate vomiting and respiratory distress. Dr. Andrew Morrison, serving with a field ambulance unit, documented the complete failure of traditional medical approaches when treating soldiers from rat-infested areas. Standard wound care procedures were useless when every injury became infected with bacteria carried by rats. Surgical instruments remained contaminated despite sterilization efforts because the creatures had introduced pathogens that existing medical knowledge couldn't address. Morrison watched helplessly as men died from minor wounds that should have healed easily in any other environment. The rats learned to associate the sound of human pain with feeding opportunities, emerging from their hiding places whenever wounded soldiers cried out. This created a horrible feedback loop, where injured men tried to suffer in silence to avoid attracting rat attention, often dying from treatable wounds, because they were afraid to call for help. The creatures had effectively weaponized human compassion, turning the natural instinct to call for aid into a dangerous liability. Corporal Stephen Blake documented the morning his unit discovered that rats had somehow learned to operate simple mechanical devices. The creatures had figured out how to open ammunition boxes, food containers, and even some types of locks by working together in coordinated groups. Blake watched in horror as rats performed tasks that seemed to require reasoning abilities far beyond what science attributed to rodents. The psychological warfare conducted by these creatures was more effective than anything human strategists had devised because it was constant, inescapable, and deeply personal. Every soldier faced his own private war against vermin that knew his individual weaknesses and exploited them with ruthless efficiency. The rats turned basic human needs, like eating, sleeping, and seeking shelter, into battles that had to be fought and won multiple times each day. The conditions went far beyond simple adaptation. Lieutenant Colonel James Whitmore of the Hampshire Regiment documents transformation of human behavior in these, what he termed the complete inversion of natural human instincts among his men. Soldiers who had once recoiled at the sight of a mouse in their childhood homes now slept peacefully, while rats the size of rabbits crawled across their chests. Men who had been raised with proper table manners ate their meager rations while rats fed from the same plate, both species competing for sustenance with equal desperation. The rum ration, that precious daily allowance of another casualty in the war against the liquid courage that made the horror bearable, became understanding of alcohol distribution schedules, positioning themselves near storage areas with rats. These creatures had developed a sophisticated oven of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers' rote military precision. Quartermaster Sergeant Peter Donn, about discovering his entire week's supply of rum contaminated by a colony of rats who had apparently been living inside the wooden casks for months. The creatures had gnawed perfect holes in the barrel staves, creating a network of tunnels that allowed them to access the alcohol while keeping their cheers in broad daylight. Their usual soldiers reported seeing intoxicated rats stumbling through Tren the rum. They were getting drunk on it. Nests dry. But the rats weren't just stealing made them easy targets. Some men found dark caution, abandoned in alcoholic stupors, that humor in watching rats exhibit the same loss of coordination and judgment that affected their human counterparts after the evening rum issue. Private Michael O'Connell wrote about a particularly memorable morning when he counted 17 dead rats around a spilled rum container, the creatures having apparently drunk themselves to death during the night. The winter of 1918 brought new horrors as both species struggled against the bitter cold that turned the Western Front into a frozen wasteland. Rats sought warmth with increasingly desperate measures, burrowing into clothing while soldiers wore it and creating nests against human flesh that provided mutual body heat. Corporal James MacDougall of the Scottish Rifles described waking up to find 3 rats hibernating inside his tunic, their small bodies pressed against his ribs like living hot water bottles. The sensation of tiny hearts beating against his own chest created an intimacy with death that haunted him for the rest of his life. The creatures learned to exploit the human addiction to tobacco with the same efficiency they showed in everything else. Soldiers hoarded their cigarette rations like precious gems, but rats discovered that tobacco made excellent nesting material. Private William Henderson found his entire month's supply of cigarettes shredded into a rat nursery. Dozens of baby rats sleeping in beds made from the tobacco that was supposed to calm his shattered nerves. The loss of cigarettes wasn't just an inconvenience. For men pushed beyond their psychological limits, tobacco was often the only thing that stood between sanity and complete mental collapse. The medical implications of this coexistence grew more horrifying as the war dragged on. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, one of the few female physicians allowed near the front lines, documented cases of soldiers whose wounds had become rat feeding stations. Injured men lying immobilized in field hospitals would wake up to find rats had been feeding on their exposed flesh during the night. The creatures showed no distinction between dead and living tissue, treating unconscious patients as convenient sources of fresh meat. But perhaps most disturbing was how the rats learned to mimic human behavior in ways that suggested they were studying their hosts. Sergeant Major Robert Fitzgerald documented rats that had learned to stand upright like soldiers during morning inspections, lined up along trench walls as if participating in military formations. Other observers reported seeing rats engaged in what appeared to be coordinated group activities that mirrored human military drills, moving in formation through trenches with purposes that remained incomprehensible to their human neighbors. The creatures affected every aspect of military supply chains in ways that rear echelon commanders never fully understood. Captain Henry Morrison, responsible for ammunition distribution in the Ypres sector, discovered that rats had learned to associate certain types of packaging with specific contents. They would ignore ammunition boxes, but systematically attack any container that might hold food, medical supplies, or tobacco. The creatures had developed the ability to identify valuable resources more efficiently than many human quartermasters. The psychological impact of constant rat exposure created new categories of mental breakdown that military psychiatrists struggled to classify. Dr. Charles Pemberton documented what he termed rodent persecution complex among patients evacuated from heavily infested sectors. These men believed that rats were following them even after they'd been moved to clean hospitals hundreds of miles from the front. They would wake up screaming about rats crawling on their faces, scratch at imaginary bites until they bled, and refuse to eat any food that hadn't been inspected multiple times for contamination. Private Thomas Clark of the Manchester Regiment wrote about the morning he discovered a rat wearing a piece of his dead friend's uniform as nesting material. The creature had somehow stripped a section of fabric from Corporal Jenkins' elaborate nest built inside a German helmet. The tunic and incorporated it into a sight of a rat sleeping comfortably in a bed made from his friend's clothing, while living in enemy equipment created a perfect symbol of how completely the war had inverted every normal human understanding of life, death, and dignity. The rats learned to exploit human compassion with calculated precision that would have impressed psychological warfare specialists. Wounded soldiers lying in no man's land reported rats approaching them with behavior that seemed almost sympathetic, nuzzling against injured men as if offering comfort. Only later did the soldiers realize that the creatures were actually testing them for signs of life, determining whether they were ready for consumption. This perversion of natural mammalian bonding behavior added another layer of psychological torture to men already pushed beyond their breaking points. Some soldiers developed elaborate protective rituals around their personal possessions that resembled religious ceremonies more than practical precautions. Lieutenant David Morrison documented the nightly routine performed by Private Anderson, who would spend an hour each evening arranging his equipment in patterns designed to confuse rats. Anderson believed that the creatures were intelligent enough to remember where items were stored, and that changing the arrangement daily would prevent them from locating his precious personal effects. Whether this strategy worked or not was impossible to determine, but the ritual provided psychological comfort in a situation where rational thought offered no solutions. The winter months brought a new horror as rats began freezing to death in unprecedented numbers, their corpses creating additional health hazards in trenches already overwhelmed by human casualties. The smell of decomposing rats mixed with rotting human flesh, stagnant water, and chemical residue from gas attacks to create an atmosphere so toxic that some men lost their sense of smell entirely. Corporal James Stewart wrote about soldiers whose nasal passages had been so damaged by constant exposure to the stench that they could no longer detect gas attacks, leaving them vulnerable to chemical weapons because their natural warning systems had been destroyed. The creatures showed remarkable adaptability to military technology, learning to avoid newly installed defensive measures within days of their implementation. Electrified barriers designed to protect food supplies were quickly circumvented as rats learned to jump over the charged wires or tunnel underneath them. Some units tried using experimental sound devices to repel rats, only to discover that the creatures adapted to the frequencies within weeks. becoming completely indifferent to noises that initially drove them away. Dr. William Harrison, serving with a mobile surgical unit, documented the complete failure of traditional sterilization procedures in rat-infested areas. Surgical instruments remained contaminated despite repeated cleaning because rats had introduced pathogens that existing medical knowledge couldn't address. Harrison watched helplessly as men died from minor wounds that should have healed easily, their injuries infected by bacteria carried in rat saliva and waste that proved resistant to all available treatments. The rats learned to associate certain human behaviors with specific opportunities, demonstrating learning abilities that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about rodent intelligence. They understood that soldiers removing gas masks after attacks would be temporarily vulnerable, timing their raids to coincide with these moments of human weakness. Corporal their nests exclusively in deactivated explosives, while Michael Patterson documented rats that seemed to understand the difference between live and dummy artillery shells, building avoiding areas where functional weapons were stored. The psychological warfare these creatures conducted was more sophisticated than anything human strategists had devised, because it targeted fundamental human needs for safety, cleanliness, and dignity. Every basic survival activity became a battle that had to be fought and won multiple times each day. Eating required constant vigilance against theft and contamination. Sleeping meant accepting that creatures would crawl across your body throughout the night. Even basic bodily functions became dangerous because rats had claimed latrines, as guards wrote about a rat. Private Edward Mills of the Welsh, their primary feeding grounds, rifle, building a nest inside that had taken up residence in the barrel that made the weapon completely useless. Mills found himself unable to remove the creature because it had somehow wedged itself so firmly inside the barrel that extraction would have required disassembling the entire rifle. He carried an inoperable weapon for 3 weeks, going into battle with a gun that had been turned into a rat nursery because replacement rifles weren't available, and admitting the situation to his officers would have resulted in disciplinary action. The creatures affected military communications in ways that revealed an almost supernatural understanding of human systems. Telegraph operators reported rats chewing through cables with timing that seemed deliberately calculated to disrupt important communications. Major William Thornfield documented multiple incidents where rats severed telephone lines, just as critical tactical information was being transmitted, cutting communications at moments that suggested the creatures understood the importance of the messages being sent. The winter brought new adaptations as rats learned to seek warmth inside soldiers' clothing while they slept, creating a grotesque form of symbiosis where survival. Men woke up with rat. Both species depended on shared body heat for tiny hearts beating against their skin, in-shaped lumps moving beneath their shirts, rhythms that matched their own pulse. Some soldiers reported feeling a strange comfort in this forced intimacy, their minds too damaged by months of horror to distinguish between companionship and parasitism. Sergeant William Crawford documented what he called the Great Rat Census, attempting to track population changes in his sector over time. His notebooks reveal explosive population growth that coincided with major battles, as increased casualties provided unlimited food sources for breeding rats. After particularly bloody engagements, Crawford estimated that rat populations could triple within 2 weeks, reaching densities that made normal military operations impossible to conduct. The rats learned to exploit the military's own organizational systems against it, using communication trenches as highways for rapid movement between sectors. They established colonies at strategic junction points where multiple trenches met, turning critical military positions into rodent capitals that were impossible to clear. Some areas became so heavily infested that they had to be abandoned, not because of enemy action, but because rat populations had made them uninhabitable for human beings. Dr. Margaret Thompson, of soldiers whose immune systems had been completely working in a casualty clearing station, documented cases overwhelmed by constant exposure to rat-borne pathogens. These men arrived at her facility with symptoms that didn't match any known diseases, couldn't identify or treat. Some appeared to be developing immunity to certain rat, their bodies fighting infections that medical science-borne illnesses, while becoming vulnerable to diseases that normally posed no threat to healthy-rawed human military organization adults. The creatures showed territorial behavior that with different rat colonies fighting vicious battles for control of prime feeding areas. Soldiers reported watching rat wars that lasted for days. Hundreds of creatures engaged in combat that was every bit as brutal as the human conflict raging above them. Some men began betting on the outcomes of these battles, finding dark entertainment in violence that didn't directly threaten their own survival. Private Jonathan Walsh of the Irish Guards wrote about discovering a rat graveyard in a shell crater, hundreds of various stages of decomposition. The smell was so overwhelming that groundant corpses floating in stagnant water in men, hardened by months of warfare, were reduced to tears. But what disturbed Walsh most wasn't the dead rats. It was the living ones that continued to swim through the putrid water, completely unbothered by their deceased companions, still searching for scraps of food with single-minded determination. The psychological impact of watching rats consume human flesh while it was still fresh created trauma that lasted decades after the war ended. Veterans would wake up screaming about rats eating their faces, nightmares that continued into old age. Some men never ate meat again after watching rats tear flesh from recently killed soldiers, their minds unable to separate human tissue from any other protein source. The war had destroyed not just their bodies and minds, but their fundamental relationship with the natural world. Captain Robert Henderson documented the complete breakdown of a military discipline when his company discovered that rats had eaten their way through an entire ammunition dump, contaminating thousands of rounds with their covered in rat droppings that waste. The bullets were still functional, but made loading weapons a nauseating experience. Orders came down from headquarters to use the contaminated ammunition anyway, as replacement supplies weren't available. Men went into battle, firing bullets that had been defecated on by the same creatures that ate their dead comrades. The rats developed that challenged scientific understanding of rodent intelligence. They would stage elaborate diversions, de-hunting strategies that demonstrated forward planning and group coordination, with some rats creating disturbances in one area while others raided food supplies in another location. Soldiers reported seeing rats posting sentries, while others fed, rotating guard duties with military precision that seemed to mock human organizational efforts. The creatures learned to associate the sound of human pain with feeding opportunities, emerging from their hiding places whenever wounded soldiers cried out. This created a horrible feedback loop, where injured men tried to suffer in silence to avoid attracting rat attention, often dying from treatable wounds because they were afraid to call for help. The rats had effectively weaponized human compassion, turning the natural instinct to call for aid into a dangerous liability. Corporal Stephen Blake documented rats that had somehow learned to operate simple mechanical devices, boxes, food containers, and even some working together in coordinated groups to open ammunition types of locks. Blake watched in horror as rats performed tasks that seemed to require reasoning abilities far beyond what science attributed to rodents. The implications were terrifying because it suggested that the creatures were not just learning to exploit human technology, the medical adapting to trench warfare, but actively challenges posed by constant rat exposure went far beyond simple bites and contamination. Field hospitals reported treating more soldiers for rat-related injuries and illnesses than for some types of combat wounds. Rat bites became infected in the filthy conditions of the trenches, leading to gangrene that required amputation. The creature's saliva contained bacteria that thrived in the anaerobic environment of deep wounds, causing infections that resisted all available treatments. Private Marcus Thompson wrote about rats that had learned to mimic human distress calls, producing sounds remarkably similar to wounded soldiers calling for help. These creatures would lure rescue parties into areas where they could scavenge from medical supplies. Their ability to imitate human voices pushing some soldiers beyond the edge of sanity. The psychological impact of being deceived by animals using the voices of dying comrades created trauma that no amount of military training could have prepared these men to handle. The winter cold brought new horrors as desperate rats began attacking living humans with increasing frequency. Sentries on night watch reported being bitten by rats attempting to gnaw through their boots to reach warm feet. The creatures had grown so bold that they would attack soldiers who were awake and alert, no longer limiting themselves to sleeping or wounded targets. Some units posted guards specifically to watch for rat attacks, turning precious human resources away from enemy observation to vermin defense. The rats learned to exploit human weakness with an efficiency that would have impressed military strategists, targeting soldiers who were already wounded or sick and sensing vulnerability the way predators identify weak prey. Men lying in field hospitals reported feeling tiny teeth testing their bandages throughout the night. Rats determining whether the wounded flesh beneath was ready for consumption. Some soldiers became so paranoid about rat attacks that they refused medical treatment, preferring to endure untreated wounds, rather than lie still long enough for the creatures to investigate them. Lieutenant Michael Thornton kept detailed accounts of what he called the Great Rat War, documenting 3 weeks his company spent in positions so heavily infested that the wooden duckboards sagged under the weight of rat colonies living beneath them. The men could hear constant scratching and chittering coming from below their feet, a sound that never stopped day or night. When they finally attempted to clear out the infestation by tearing up sections of flooring, they discover of yards underground, complete with storaged rat cities that stretched for hundreds chambers, packed with stolen rations, bits of uniform, and unidentifiable organic matter. The creatures showed no fear of weapons that terrified human beings, scurrying between soldiers' legs during firefights and nesting inside the barrels of unused rifles. They had transformed deadly weapons into rodent nurseries, turning instruments of war into symbols of their complete domination over the human environment. Some rats had grown so bold that they would steal food directly from soldiers' hands while they were mouthfuls of bread or meat eating, grabbing M and disappearing into holes before the startled men could react. The transformation wasn't just physical or psychological. These soldiers were losing fundamental aspects of their humanity, and the rats seemed to sense this vulnerability like predators smelling blood in the water. They grew bolder and more aggressive with each passing day, treating the soldiers not as threats to be avoided, but as fellow inhabitants of this underground kingdom where death was the only constant, and dignity was a luxury no one could afford. The psychological impact went beyond individual trauma. Entire units began exhibiting collective behaviors that resembled the rats they lived with. Captain Francis Pemberton documented soldiers who had started moving in groups through trenches, staying close together for protection, just like rat colonies. They would freeze simultaneously when they heard unfamiliar sounds, dozens of men crouching motionless until the perceived threat passed. Most disturbingly, even obsessively, hiding scraps in their clothing and equipment, they had begun hoarding food with the same desperate intensity displayed by their rodent neighbors. The rats learned to exploit the human addiction to routine with calculated precision. Soldiers clung to small rituals as anchors to sanity, simple activities like cleaning their rifles or writing letters home. The creatures observed these patterns and timed their attacks to coincide with moments when men were most vulnerable. Private Daniel Murphy of the Royal Irish Rifles wrote about rats that would wait until he was absorbed in writing to his mother before launching coordinated raids on his equipment. The timing was so consistent that Murphy began to suspect the rats understood the emotional significance of these impacts. The winter brought new forms moments and deliberately chose them for maximum psychological of horror, as both species struggled against cold that penetrated bone and soul. Corporal James Mitchell discovered that rats had learned to start fires by gnawing through electrical equipment, creating sparks that ignited stored materials. These tiny arsonists burned down dugouts and supply depots with efficiency that rivaled enemy saboteurs. Mitchell watched helplessly as months of carefully hoarded supplies went up in flames, started by creatures seeking warmth in the most destructive way possible. The medical situation deteriorated beyond anything military planners had anticipated. Dr. Richard Blackwood documented cases of soldiers whose wounds had become permanent feeding stations for rats. The creatures would return night after night to the same injured men, treating open wounds like personal restaurants. Some rats had learned to keep wounds open by preventing scabs from forming, ensuring a continuous supply of fresh blood and tissue. Blackwood found himself amputating limbs, not because of battle injuries, but because rats had infected wounds so systematically that gangrene was inevitable. Private Arthur Henley wrote about the morning he discovered his gas mask had been turned into a rat maternity ward during the night. Dozens of pink babies, each no bigger than his canvas designed to save Thumb, nested among the rubber in his life during chemical attacks. When the inevitable gas alarm sounded 3 hours later, Henley faced an impossible choice: wear a contaminated mask that might kill him, or face chlorine gas with no protection at all. He chose the mask, spending the attack breathing air filtered through rat birth fluids, while trying not to vomit inside the sealed equipment. The creatures affected military strategy in ways that generals sitting in comfortable chateaux never comprehended. Communication networks collapsed not because of enemy action, but because rats had systematically destroyed every wire, cable, and telephone line in their territory. Major William Harrison found himself commanding a battalion that couldn't communicate with headquarters, other units, or even positions 50 yards away because rats had eaten through months of communication infrastructure in a single week. The rats with disturbing accuracy. Soldiers reported seeing developed social hierarchies that mirrored human military structure. Larger rats that appeared to command smaller ones, directing group activities with squeaks and gestures that resembled military signals. Corporal David Thompson documented what he called rat officers, creatures that would position themselves on elevated positions to observe human activities, while smaller rats carried out specific tasks. The parallels between rat organization and human military structure created an unsettling sense that the creatures were not just adapting to trench warfare, but actively participating in it. The psychological warfare conducted by these animals was more effective than anything human intelligence services had developed. They learned individual soldiers' fears and exploited them with surgical precision. Men who were afraid of darkness found rats targeting them specifically during night watches. Soldiers who were claustrophobic discovered rats blocking their escape routes during attacks. Those who were squeamish about blood woke up to find rats had left partially consumed corpses in their sleeping areas. Lieutenant Charles Whitmore documented the complete transformation of his men's relationship with basic human needs. Eating had become a battle requiring constant vigilance and strategic planning. Soldiers would post lookouts, while others consumed their rations, treating mealtime like a military operation, requiring coordination and security measures. Some men stopped eating altogether during daylight hours, consuming their food only in complete darkness when they couldn't see the rats competing for every morsel. The creatures learned to weaponize human compassion with devastating effectiveness. They would drag injured baby rats into areas where soldiers could see them, somehow understanding that some men couldn't resist helping wounded animals even when those animals belonged to a species that was slowly driving them insane. Private Michael O'Sullivan wrote about spending precious medical supplies treating a rat with a broken leg, knowing the creature would probably attack him the moment it recovered, but unable to ignore its suffering. The smell had evolved beyond simple decomposition into something that defied human comprehension. Sergeant Robert Davies described it as the odor of civilization itself rotting away, a combination of death, waste, fear, and desperation that saturated everything so completely that men lost the ability to imagine clean air. Some soldiers reported that the stench had become so familiar it was actually comforting, their minds associating the horrible smell with survival because it meant they were still alive to experience it. The rats showed remarkable innovation in their nest-building techniques, creating structures that would have impressed architects. They wove together human hair, fabric threads, paper fragments, and organic matter into elaborate dwellings that provided insulation, drainage, and multiple escape routes. Private Edmund Walsh discovered a rat city built inside a collapsed German bunker that housed hundreds of creatures in a complex network of chambers connected by precisely engineered tunnels. The medical implications grew more horrifying as doctors began documenting cases of humans developing rat-like behaviors and physical adaptations. Soldiers who had lived in heavily infested areas for extended periods showed changes in their nervous systems that resembled rodent behavior patterns. They would twitch their noses constantly, testing the air for threats. Their sleep patterns shifted to match rat activity cycles. Some men developed enhanced night vision that allowed them to navigate trenches in complete darkness, but at the cost of becoming nearly blind in daylight. Dr. Helen Morrison documented what she termed rodent mimicry syndrome among patients evacuated from the worst infested sectors. These men moved with quick, jerky motions that resembled rat movements. They would freeze instantly at unexpected sounds, remaining motionless for minutes at a time. Most disturbing of all, they had developed the ability to squeeze through spaces that should have been too small for human bodies, their bones apparently becoming more flexible after months of following rat escape routes through collapsed trenches. The creatures learned to exploit human superstitions with calculated cruelty. Soldiers had developed elaborate rituals around personal protective items like lucky charms, family photographs, and religious symbols. Rats began targeting these objects specifically, somehow understanding their psychological importance to their human neighbors. Private Thomas Anderson found his mother's photograph shredded into nesting material, the pieces scattered throughout a rat colony in a pattern that seemed deliberately arranged to cause maximum emotional damage. The winter of 1918 brought the ultimate horror as starving rats began forming cooperative hunting packs that targeted living humans. These groups would surround isolated soldiers, cutting off escape routes with military precision before launching coordinated attacks. Corporal William Stewart documented an incident where a pack of over 30 rats attacked a wounded soldier, working together to strip flesh from his bones while he was still conscious. The man's screams attracted other rats, turning the attack into a feeding frenzy that lasted for hours. The psychological impact of watching human beings become indistinguishable from the vermin they lived with created trauma that extended far beyond individual soldiers. Officers reported losing the ability to maintain discipline because they could no longer tell the difference between human and animal behavior. Captain Henry Blackwood wrote about soldiers who had begun communicating primarily through squeaks and clicking sounds, their ability to use human language deteriorating after months of trying to understand rat communication patterns. The rats affected every aspect of military supply distribution, learning to identify valuable resources more efficiently than human quartermasters. They would ignore worthless materials while systematically targeting medical supplies, ammunition, and food stores. Some creatures had apparently learned to read military markings, consistently attacking containers marked with symbols that indicated valuable contents while leaving unmarked boxes untouched. Private Kenneth Mills documented rats that had learned to use human tools, manipulating knives, forks, and other implements to access food sources that would otherwise be unreachable. These creatures would work in teams, with some rats holding tools, while others positioned themselves to catch falling food. The sight of animals using human technology with greater skill than some soldiers possessed created an existential crisis that broke minds already strained beyond their limits. The creatures began exhibiting behaviors that suggested they understood human emotions and deliberately targeted men who were already psychologically vulnerable. Shell-shocked soldiers found themselves specifically hunted by rats that seemed to sense their weakened mental state. These predators would follow damaged men through trenches, appearing whenever their targets were alone and vulnerable, as if they could smell psychological weakness the same way they detected physical injury. Lieutenant David Morrison wrote about the morning his unit discovered that rats had somehow learned to operate simple machinery, using their combined weight to activate mechanical devices that opened supply containers. The creatures had figured out that working together, they could accomplish tasks that were impossible for individual rats, demonstrating problem-solving abilities that challenged everything humans thought they knew about animal intelligence. The medical challenges had evolved beyond traditional disease and injury into something that resembled biological warfare. Rats had become living weapons, carrying concentrated doses of pathogens that had evolved specifically to thrive in trench conditions. Dr. William Hartwell documented infections that seemed designed to keep humans alive but suffering, ensuring a continuous food source for the creatures that had introduced them. The transformation was complete. Men who had entered the trenches as civilized human beings had become something else entirely. Creatures that existed somewhere between human and animal. Their minds and bodies adapted to a reality that defied every principle of civilized existence. They slept in beds made from corpses, ate food contaminated with rat waste, and found comfort in the presence of vermin that had grown fat on human flesh. Corporal James Anderson wrote his final letter home, describing soldiers who no longer remembered their own names, but could identify individual rats by sight and sound. These men had developed complex relationships with specific creatures, treating some rats as allies while waging personal wars against others. The line between predator and prey had become so blurred that it was impossible to determine which species was actually in control of the trenches. The rats had won, not through superior numbers or intelligence, but by transforming their human neighbors into creatures that were no longer entirely human. They had created a hybrid civilization where the distinction between species became meaningless, where survival required abandoning every principle that separated humans from animals. The winter brought new horrors, as both species faced starvation together, competing for resources that were becoming increasingly scarce. Some soldiers reported forming hunting partnerships with rats, working together to locate food sources that neither species could access alone. These alliances violated every natural law, creating relationships that were simultaneously symbiotic and parasitic. Private George Patterson documented the morning he woke up to find a rat had died in his arms during the night, its small body pressed against his chest for warmth. Instead of revulsion, Patterson felt genuine grief for the creature that had shared his body heat during the frozen hours before dawn. He buried the rat with more ceremony than many dead soldiers received, marking its grave with a wooden cross made from broken rifle stocks. The psychological impact extended beyond the battlefield into the very concept of human identity. Men who survived the rat-infested trenches returned home fundamentally changed, carrying within themselves a piece of the underground kingdom they had inhabited. They moved differently, thought differently, and related to the natural world in ways that civilian populations couldn't understand. The rats had accomplished what no human enemy could achieve. They had transformed an entire generation of young men into something that was neither fully human nor completely animal, creating a new species of survivor that carried the marks of their underground evolution long after the guns fell silent. The war would end, but the transformation was permanent, written into the very cells of men who had learned to live as rats, among rats in the deepest hell humanity had ever created. The transformation of these men wasn't just psychological. Their bodies began changing in ways that doctors couldn't explain. Sergeant William Hartley of the Yorkshire Regiment documented soldiers whose fingernails had grown thick and curved, resembling claws that were better suited for digging through debris and fighting off rats than handling military equipment. Some men developed enhanced hearing that allowed them to detect rat movement through solid walls, but left them unable to filter out the constant noise of artillery bombardment that drove others to seek shelter. Private Charles Melbourne wrote about comrades whose teeth had become permanently stained brown, from chewing on anything they could find to supplement their meager rations. These men would gnaw on leather, wood, and even metal when hunger became unbearable, their jaws developing the powerful muscles needed to extract nutrition from materials that would have broken civilian teeth. Melbourne watched his best friend crack open rat skulls with his bare teeth, sucking out the brains with the same methodical efficiency displayed by the creatures they were supposed to be fighting. The rum rations that were supposed to provide liquid courage became another source of horror, as soldiers discovered that intoxicated rats were even more aggressive than sober ones. These creatures would seek out spilled alcohol with desperate intensity, becoming violent and unpredictable after consuming the precious spirits that men needed to face another day in hell. Corporal James MacLeod documented rats that would attack in coordinated groups after drinking, their inhibitions lowered just like their human counterparts, but their natural aggression amplified to levels that made them genuinely dangerous opponents. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, working in a forward aid station, documented cases of soldiers who had developed what she termed adaptive cannibalism syndrome. These men had begun consuming rat flesh not from desperation, but from genuine preference, their taste buds having adapted to find rodent meat more palatable than standard military rations. Mitchell watched in horror as soldiers would catch rats during quiet periods, preparing and cooking the creatures with techniques that suggested they had been practicing this dietary supplement for months. The lice infestation added another layer of torment that multiplied the existing horror exponentially. These parasites bred in the seams of unwashed uniforms, creating colonies that numbered in the millions on individual soldiers. But the lice weren't just feeding on human blood. They were also parasitizing the rats, creating a complex ecosystem where 3 species competed for survival in conditions that should have been impossible for any life form to endure. Private Daniel O'Brien wrote about the morning ritual that had become more important than weapon cleaning or enemy observation. Every soldier would spend the first hour of daylight picking lice from their clothing and bodies, crushing the creatures between their fingernails with mechanical precision that had become second nature. The popping sound of exploding lice created a constant background noise in quiet sectors, a percussion section in the symphony of suffering that defined trench existence. The rats had learned to exploit lice infestations as another food source, grooming soldiers while they slept and consuming the parasites with systematic thoroughness that provided mutual benefit. Some men reported waking up to find rats had spent the night cleaning lice from their hair and clothing, turning their human hosts into feeding stations for both parasites and predators in an arrangement that defied every principle of natural behavior. Lieutenant Robert Ashford documented soldiers who had stopped trying to remove lice entirely, accepting the constant itching and blood loss as simply another aspect of their new existence. These men would scratch themselves until they bled, creating open wounds that attracted both rats and more lice in a cycle of infestation that accelerated with each passing week. Ashford watched his own soldiers transform into walking ecosystems, their bodies supporting multiple species in relationships that were simultaneously parasitic and symbiotic. The mud had evolved beyond simple earth and water into something that seemed almost alive. Years of blood, decomposing flesh, chemical contamination, and waste from millions of humans and rats had created a substance that moved and shifted with its own malevolent intelligence. Private Kenneth Walsh described mud that would grab at soldiers' feet like quicksand, pulling them down into depths where previous victims had already disappeared forever. Corporal Timothy Morrison documented the morning his patrol discovered what they initially thought was solid ground, but turned out to be a crust covering a pit filled with liquid decomposition. The surface looked safe until men began breaking through, falling into a soup of rotting corpses, rat waste, and chemical runoff that had been fermenting for months. Morrison watched 2 soldiers disappear completely into the putrid mixture, their screams cut short as the toxic liquid filled their mouths and lungs. The mud carried diseases that had evolved specifically in trench conditions, pathogens that couldn't exist anywhere else, but thrived in the unique environment created by industrial warfare. Dr. William Henderson documented infections that ate through human flesh with the same efficiency as chemical weapons, turning minor scratches into gangrenous wounds that required immediate amputation. Some soldiers developed immunity to these diseases, but at the cost of becoming carriers who spread the infections to anyone they encountered. Private Michael Thompson wrote about mud that had become so saturated with decomposing organic matter that it would spontaneously generate heat, creating warm patches in otherwise frozen trenches that attracted both humans and rats seeking relief from the bitter cold. These areas became gathering points where both species would huddle together for warmth, their natural hostility temporarily suspended by shared desperation for survival. The constant dampness had transformed clothing into breeding grounds for organisms that defied scientific classification. Uniforms that hadn't been changed in months developed their own ecosystems, supporting life forms that fed on fabric, human skin, and anything else they could find. Sergeant David Patterson documented soldiers whose clothing had literally rotted away while they wore it, leaving men naked in freezing trenches because their uniforms had been consumed by organisms they had unknowingly cultivated. The hunger had reached levels that made men consider options that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Standard rations provided perhaps half the calories needed to sustain life under the physical demands of trench warfare. And when rats contaminated or stole even these meager supplies, soldiers faced starvation that drove them to desperate measures. Captain Henry Morrison wrote about finding his men eating grass, tree bark, and leather from their own equipment in attempts to fill their empty stomachs. Private Thomas Anderson documented the morning he watched a group of soldiers fight over a piece of bread that had been partially consumed by rats and contaminated with their droppings. The men didn't clean the bread or remove the visible rat waste. They simply divided it equally and ate it without discussion, their minds having accepted that contaminated food was better than no food at all. Anderson found himself joining the meal, discovering that his own standards had quietly eroded to match those of his desperate comrades. The addiction to rum had become more powerful than fear of death or enemy fire. Men who had depleted their daily ration would trade anything for additional alcohol, including ammunition, medical supplies, and personal possessions that represented their last connections to home. Corporal James Mitchell documented soldiers who would drink anything that contained alcohol, including medical antiseptics, industrial solvents, and even antifreeze from abandoned vehicles. Some men began distilling their own alcohol using techniques learned from watching fermentation processes in stagnant water pools contaminated with organic matter. Private William Patterson wrote about soldiers who had figured out how to extract alcohol from decomposing potatoes, rotting fruit, and even fermented rat corpses, creating beverages that were toxic enough to cause blindness, but provided the numbing effect that made continued existence bearable. The psychological dependency on alcohol had become so complete that men would risk their lives retrieving bottles from no man's land, crawling through machine gun fire and artillery bombardments to recover precious spirits from the bodies of dead soldiers. Lieutenant Charles Pemberton watched helplessly as his best men died attempting to salvage rum from supply dumps that had been targeted by enemy artillery, their addiction overriding every survival instinct. Dr. Margaret Thompson documented cases of alcohol poisoning that were complicated by malnutrition, disease, and exposure to chemical weapons, creating medical conditions that existing knowledge couldn't address. Soldiers would arrive at aid stations unconscious from drinking industrial alcohol contaminated with rat urine, their bodies simultaneously fighting multiple toxins while trying to process nutrients from food sources that would have been considered inedible in civilian settings. The rotting corpses that littered every section of trench had become part of the landscape, incorporated into daily life with acceptance that would have horrified their peacetime selves. Bodies were used as furniture, building materials, and even sources of warmth when firewood wasn't available. Private George Henley wrote about sleeping on a bed made from frozen German corpses, arranging the bodies to create a mattress that kept him off the frozen ground during the brutal winter nights. Sergeant William Crawford documented the systematic harvesting of useful materials from decomposing soldiers, a practice that had evolved from desperate necessity into organized efficiency. Boots, clothing, equipment, and personal effects were stripped from corpses with mechanical precision, the dead becoming supply depots for the living in an economy based entirely on recycling materials from those who no longer needed them. The smell of decomposition had become so pervasive that soldiers lost the ability to detect fresh death, making it impossible to locate recently killed comrades who might still be saved. Corporal Michael Patterson wrote about walking past dying men for hours without realizing they were still alive, their cries for help lost in the background noise of constant groaning and gurgling from bodies in various stages of decay. Some corpses had become integrated into trench construction, their bones providing structural support for walls, and their flesh serving as mortar that held earthworks together. Private Kenneth Mills documented sections of trench where human remains were so thoroughly incorporated into the fortifications that removing the dead would have caused the entire structure to collapse, burying the living under tons of mud and decomposing flesh. The rats had learned to preserve human corpses using techniques that would have impressed professional embalmers, treating bodies with their own saliva and waste products to slow decomposition and ensure a steady food supply over extended periods. Lieutenant David Morrison discovered rat colonies that maintained what could only be described as meat lockers, chambers where human remains were stored in conditions that kept them fresh for weeks. Captain Robert Henderson wrote about soldiers who had begun mimicking rat preservation techniques, treating their own wounds and equipment with rat saliva because they had observed that materials exposed to these secretions seemed to last longer in the harsh trench environment. These men had crossed a line that separated human from animal behavior, adopting the survival strategies of creatures they had once considered their enemies. The transformation was accelerating as winter tightened its grip on the Western Front. Men who had started the war as civilized human beings were becoming something entirely different. Creatures adapted to an environment that existed nowhere else on Earth. They moved like rats through their underground kingdom, thinking like rats, surviving like rats, and slowly losing the ability to remember what it had felt like to be human. Private Arthur Pearson documented soldiers who had stopped using human language entirely, communicating through squeaks, clicks, and gestures that more closely resembled rat communication than human speech. These men could still understand orders from their officers, but they had lost the ability or desire to engage in normal conversation, their minds having adapted to a reality where human social interaction was not just unnecessary, but potentially dangerous. The medical implications had evolved beyond disease and injury into fundamental changes in human physiology that doctors couldn't explain or treat. Soldiers were developing enhanced night vision, improved hearing, and increased flexibility that allowed them to navigate collapsed trenches and tight spaces with ease. But these adaptations came at the cost of their ability to function in normal human environments. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell documented cases of soldiers who could no longer tolerate bright light, their eyes having adapted to the perpetual twilight of underground existence. These men would become violent when exposed to sunlight, covering their faces and seeking dark corners where they would huddle like nocturnal animals waiting for nightfall. Their circadian rhythms had shifted to match those of the creatures they lived with, making them active during hours when normal humans slept. The hunger had driven men to develop digestive systems that could process materials that would have been toxic to their peacetime selves. Corporal James McDougall wrote about soldiers who could eat spoiled food, contaminated water, and even small amounts of industrial chemicals without apparent ill effects, their bodies having adapted to extract nutrition from sources that would have killed civilian populations. Some men had learned to hibernate during the coldest periods, slowing their metabolism and entering states of suspended animation that allowed them to survive on minimal food and water. Private Thomas Fletcher documented soldiers who would remain motionless for days at a time. Their breathing and heart rate slowed to levels that resembled death, but allowed them to conserve energy when resources were scarce. The rats had begun exhibiting human-like behaviors that suggested they were learning from their hosts as much as the humans were learning from them. These creatures would stand upright for extended periods, use tools with increasing sophistication, and engage in what appeared to be complex social rituals that mimicked human military ceremonies. Lieutenant Charles Whitmore watched rats performing what looked like funeral rites over their dead, arranged in formations that resembled human burial services. The psychological boundaries between species had dissolved so completely that some soldiers could no longer distinguish between human and rat thoughts, their minds having merged with the collective consciousness of the creatures they lived among. Captain Francis Pemberton documented men who claimed they could hear rat thoughts, understand rat emotions, and communicate telepathically with individual creatures that had become their companions and protectors. The transformation was irreversible. These men had crossed evolutionary boundaries that separated species, becoming something new that carried traits from both humans and rats. They had adapted to survive in conditions that should have killed them, but at the cost of everything that had once made them recognizably human. The war would eventually end, but the creatures it had created would carry the marks of their underground evolution for the rest of their lives. Private Edmund Walsh wrote his final diary entry about no longer remembering his mother's face or the sound of her voice, but being able to identify individual rats by their scent and recognize their emotional states through subtle changes in their body language. He had become fluent in a language that existed nowhere else on Earth, a hybrid communication system that blended human intelligence with animal instinct in ways that defied every principle of natural evolution. The winter of 1918 was ending, but the transformation it had wrought was permanent. Men who survived the rat-infested trenches would return to a world that no longer had a place for creatures like them, beings who existed somewhere between human and animal, carrying within themselves the genetic memory of humanity's descent into its most primitive survival state. The mud was beginning to thaw, releasing gases from decomposing organic matter that had been frozen for months. The smell was indescribable, a combination of death, decay, and chemical contamination that made breathing an act of will rather than instinct. But for the creatures who had learned to call this place home, the changing season brought new opportunities and challenges that would test their ability to survive in an environment that continued to evolve in ways that defied human comprehension. The rats were preparing for spring breeding season, their populations ready to explode once again, as warmer weather provided ideal conditions for reproduction. The soldiers who shared their underground kingdom were preparing too, though for what, none of them could say. They had become something new, something that had never existed before in human history, and they were about to discover what role creatures like them would play in a world that was slowly awakening from the nightmare of industrial warfare. The rats had learned to exploit the human obsession with mail call with devastating psychological precision. These creatures understood that letters from home represented the last threads connecting soldiers to their former lives, and they targeted these precious communications with surgical accuracy. Private Robert McNamara of the Dublin Fusiliers wrote about discovering that rats had built an entire nest from fragments of love letters, family photographs, and news from Ireland. The creatures had somehow sorted through hundreds of pieces of mail, selecting the most emotionally significant items to incorporate into their breeding chambers. Corporal William Hayes documented the morning ritual that had replaced traditional military inspections in his sector. Instead of checking weapons and equipment, soldiers would spend their first waking hours searching for letters that rats had stolen during the night. These creatures had developed techniques for opening envelopes that would have impressed professional thieves, using their teeth to create precise incisions that left the paper intact while accessing the contents inside. The psychological warfare was calculated and cruel. Rats would leave fragments of destroyed letters where soldiers would find them, positioning torn photographs and scattered words in patterns that seemed designed to cause maximum emotional damage. Lieutenant James Patterson found pieces of his wife's final letter arranged in a perfect circle around a rat nest. The creatures having somehow understood that destroying this particular communication would break something fundamental inside him. Some soldiers developed elaborate protection systems for their mail that resembled the security measures used to guard military secrets. Private Thomas Anderson would sleep with letters pressed against his body, sealed inside multiple layers of oiled cloth and tied with wire that cut into his flesh. The physical pain was preferable to losing the only connection he had to a world where people still remembered his name and cared whether he lived or died. The rats had learned to forge relationships with individual soldiers based on their emotional vulnerabilities. Corporal Michael Thompson documented a creature he called Napoleon, a particularly large rat that had made its nest inside his dead brother's helmet. Napoleon would appear whenever Thompson was reading letters from home, positioning itself where it could observe his emotional reactions. The rat seemed to feed on human grief as much as it fed on corpses, growing larger and more aggressive after witnessing displays of sorrow or desperation. Dr. Helen Morrison, working in a mobile psychiatric unit, documented cases of soldiers who had begun writing letters to rats, treating the creatures as pen pals who could carry messages to dead comrades. These men would spend hours composing detailed correspondence addressed to specific rats, describing their fears, hopes, and memories with an intimacy they had never shared with human beings. Morrison found herself reading love letters written to vermin, romantic poetry dedicated to creatures that had grown fat on human flesh. The hunger had evolved beyond simple starvation into a condition that affected every aspect of human consciousness. Soldiers would dream about food with hallucinatory intensity, experiencing taste, smell, and texture of meals that existed only in their imaginations. Private Kenneth Mills wrote about waking up with the taste of his mother's apple pie so vivid in his mouth that he could feel pastry crumbs between his teeth, only to discover he had been chewing on pieces of leather torn from his own boots. The obsession with food had created new forms of currency in the underground economy of the trenches. Men would trade ammunition for crumbs, medical supplies for sips of contaminated water, and personal possessions for the privilege of licking plates that other soldiers had already cleaned. Sergeant David Morrison documented elaborate bartering systems where the value of items was determined entirely by their potential nutritional content rather than their military or practical utility. Some soldiers had learned to supplement their diet by eating materials that would have been considered inedible in civilian life. Corporal James MacLeod wrote about men who had developed techniques for extracting nutrients from paper, cloth, and even human hair. These improvised meals provided minimal calories, but gave starving men the psychological comfort of feeling full, even if their bodies continued to waste away from malnutrition. The rats had become connoisseurs of human desperation, learning to identify soldiers who were closest to starvation and targeting them for psychological torment. These creatures would position themselves just out of reach with pieces of stolen food, apparently understanding that the sight of nourishment they couldn't access was more devastating than simple hunger. Private William Henderson documented rats that would eat slowly and deliberately while maintaining eye contact with starving soldiers, their behavior suggesting an almost sadistic pleasure in human suffering. The addiction to rum had created dependencies that transcended simple alcoholism and entered realms of chemical slavery that modern medicine couldn't address. Men who had been denied their daily ration would exhibit withdrawal symptoms that included violent seizures, hallucinations so vivid they mistook rats for enemy soldiers, and suicidal depression that made them welcome artillery bombardments as potential relief from psychological agony. Lieutenant Charles Pemberton documented the elaborate rituals that had developed around rum distribution, ceremonies that resembled religious services more than military procedures. Soldiers would line up hours before the appointed time, their hands shaking with anticipation that had nothing to do with enemy fire. The quartermaster had become a high priest, dispensing liquid salvation to congregants who had forgotten every other form of worship except the daily communion with alcohol that made continued existence bearable. Some men had learned to distill alcohol from sources that would have horrified their peacetime selves. Private George Patterson wrote about soldiers who had figured out how to extract spirits from decomposing potatoes found in abandoned German positions, fermenting the rotting vegetables in containers made from human skulls. The resulting beverage was toxic enough to cause permanent blindness, but it provided the numbing effect that allowed men to sleep without dreaming about the faces of dead comrades. The medical implications of chronic alcohol dependency combined with malnutrition and disease had created conditions that challenged every principle of human physiology. Dr. William Harrison documented patients whose bodies had adapted to process industrial alcohol as their primary source of calories, their digestive systems evolving to extract nutrients from substances that should have killed them. These men had become living laboratories for studying the limits of human adaptability under conditions of extreme stress. The lice infestations had reached levels that transformed individual soldiers into walking ecosystems supporting millions of parasites. These creatures lived, bred, and died in the seams of unwashed uniforms, creating colonies so dense that clothing would move with their own internal motion. Corporal Timothy Morrison wrote about uniforms that had to be beaten with sticks before being worn, the impact necessary to temporarily stun enough lice to make the garments tolerable. Private Daniel O'Brien documented the sound of lice feeding, a constant background noise that resembled gentle rainfall, but was actually the collective noise of millions of parasites consuming human blood. This auditory assault never stopped, creating a soundtrack of infestation that drove some men to scratch themselves until they bled, their fingernails worn down to the quick from constant attempts to remove creatures that reproduced faster than they could be killed. The psychological impact of being constantly consumed by parasites had created new categories of mental breakdown that military psychiatrists struggled to classify. Soldiers would hallucinate that lice were crawling under their skin, scratching at imaginary infestations long after they had been deloused. Some men developed obsessive behaviors around parasite removal, spending hours each day picking through their clothing and examining every inch of their bodies for signs of infestation. Dr. Margaret Thompson documented cases of soldiers whose immune systems had been so overwhelmed by lice-borne diseases that they had developed partial immunity to typhus, trench fever, and other parasitic illnesses. These men had become walking laboratories for studying disease resistance, their bodies having adapted to coexist with pathogens that would have killed civilian populations. But their immunity came at the cost of chronic weakness, persistent fever, and skin conditions that made them appear more dead than alive. The mud had evolved into something that seemed to possess malevolent intelligence, grabbing at soldiers with tendrils of decomposing organic matter that moved independently of wind or gravity. Private Arthur Pearson wrote about mud that would shift and flow like liquid during the day, but solidify at night, trapping men who had sought shelter in what appeared to be soft ground. These soldiers would wake up encased in hardened earth that required hours of digging to escape, assuming they had the strength to free themselves before suffocating. Corporal William Crawford documented areas where the mud had become so saturated with chemicals from gas attacks that it would spontaneously ignite when disturbed, creating fires that burned with unnatural colors and produced smoke that was toxic even by the standards of chemical warfare. These blazes would consume everything they touched, including human flesh, and could not be extinguished with water because the mud itself had become a form of liquid incendiary device. The constant moisture had created conditions where traditional concepts of solid ground no longer applied. Soldiers would step on what appeared to be firm earth, only to sink through a crust covering pools of liquid decomposition that could swallow a man completely. Lieutenant David Morrison lost 3 men to what he called mud quicksand, watching helplessly as soldiers disappeared into putrid soup that had been fermenting for months in shell craters. Some areas had developed their own weather systems, with steam rising from warm patches where decomposition generated enough heat to create localized fog banks. These mists carried diseases, chemical residue, and the concentrated stench of rotting flesh, creating atmospheric conditions that were toxic to breathe. Private Michael Thompson wrote about fog so thick with corruption that soldiers would vomit simply from inhaling air that had passed through these contaminated zones. The corpses that littered every section of trench had become architectural elements in the underground cities that both humans and rats called home. Bodies were stacked like sandbags to reinforce walls, arranged as furniture for sleeping and eating, and even used as tools for digging when proper equipment wasn't available. Sergeant Robert Fitzgerald documented the systematic integration of human remains into trench construction, noting that removing the dead would cause entire sections of fortification to collapse. Private Thomas Fletcher wrote about sleeping arrangements that would have been unthinkable in civilian life, but had become standard practice in the trenches. Living soldiers would position themselves between rows of corpses that provided insulation from the cold, windbreaks from artillery blast, and even camouflage from enemy observation. These men had learned to treat dead bodies as resources rather than remains of former comrades, their minds having adapted to separate emotional attachment from practical necessity. The preservation techniques, developed by both humans and rats, had created storage systems for maintaining fresh meat supplies over extended periods. Captain Henry Morrison discovered chambers where human remains were kept in conditions that slowed decomposition, treated with rat saliva and other organic compounds that acted as natural preservatives. These makeshift morgues provided protein sources during the harshest winter months when no other food was available. Some soldiers had begun harvesting useful materials from corpses with efficiency that would have impressed professional undertakers. Bones were fashioned into tools and weapons, skin was used for waterproofing equipment, and organs were processed for their nutritional content. Corporal James McDougall documented the complete utilization of human remains, noting that nothing was wasted in an environment where every resource was precious beyond calculation. The rats had developed funeral customs that seemed to mock human burial traditions, gathering around dead members of their species in formations that resembled military ceremonies. Lieutenant Charles Whitmore observed rats standing at attention while others carried deceased comrades to designated burial areas, their behavior suggesting emotional responses that challenged scientific understanding of rodent psychology. These creatures had learned to use human corpses as communication devices, arranging bodies in patterns that seemed to convey messages between different rat colonies. Private Kenneth Walsh documented corpse formations that appeared to serve as territorial markers, warnings to competing groups, and even what looked like artistic expressions created by animals that had developed aesthetic sensibilities beyond their natural capabilities. The psychological impact of living among the dead had transformed soldiers' relationships with their own mortality in ways that transcended simple acceptance of death. Men would practice dying, lying motionless among corpses for hours to experience what it felt like to be dead while remaining conscious. Corporal Michael Patterson wrote about soldiers who had become more comfortable among the dead than the living, preferring the company of corpses to interaction with fellow soldiers who might still possess remnants of human emotion. Dr. Sarah Mitchell documented cases of soldiers who had developed the ability to communicate with recently deceased comrades, claiming they could hear voices from bodies that had been dead for days. These men would hold conversations with corpses, reporting detailed discussions about military strategy, family news, and plans for after the war. Whether these interactions were hallucinations or evidence of previously unknown capabilities developed under extreme stress remained a mystery that medical science couldn't address. The transformation accelerated as spring approached, bringing new challenges that would test every adaptation these creature men had developed during their underground evolution. The thawing mud released gases that had been trapped beneath frozen surfaces for months, creating atmospheric conditions that were toxic beyond measurement. The increasing temperatures provided ideal breeding conditions for both rats and disease-carrying insects, setting the stage for population explosions that would overwhelm even their enhanced survival capabilities. Private Edmund Clark wrote about changes in his own body that he couldn't explain or control. His fingernails had become thick and claw-like, perfect for digging through debris and fighting off aggressive rats. His teeth had grown sharper and stronger, capable of cracking bones and processing foods that would have broken civilian dental work. His eyes had adapted to see clearly in complete darkness, but bright light now caused pain so intense he could barely function during daylight hours. The medical implications of these physical changes extended beyond simple adaptation into fundamental alterations of human genetics that would affect future generations. Dr. William Henderson documented soldiers whose children, conceived during brief leave periods, were born with enhanced night vision, increased resistance to disease, and behavioral patterns that more closely resembled animal instincts than human social development. Sergeant William Hartley observed that men who had survived the longest in rat-infested trenches were developing collective consciousness similar to hive mind behavior seen in insect colonies. These soldiers would move together without verbal communication, respond to threats with coordinated precision that suggested telepathic connection, and make group decisions through processes that resembled animal pack behavior more than human reasoning. The rats had begun exhibiting increasingly human-like characteristics, standing upright for extended periods, using tools with sophisticated precision, and engaging in social rituals that seemed to mimic military ceremonies they had observed. Some creatures had learned to salute, march in formation, and even attempt to mimic human speech patterns with varying degrees of success. Lieutenant Robert Ashford documented rats that could reproduce simple words and phrases, their attempts at human language creating sounds that were simultaneously amusing and deeply disturbing. The psychological boundaries between species had dissolved so completely that some soldiers claimed they could share memories with individual rats, experiencing the creatures' perspectives on battles, understanding their emotional responses to death and violence, and accessing collective knowledge that had been accumulated by rat colonies over months of coexistence with human forces. Captain Francis Pemberton wrote about men who had stopped identifying themselves by name, rank, or unit designation, instead adopting identification systems based on their relationships with specific rat colonies. These soldiers would introduce themselves by describing which rats they lived with, what role they played in interspecies survival strategies, and how their human capabilities complemented the natural abilities of their rodent partners. The transformation was entering its final phase as winter gave way to spring. The creatures that had once been British, German, French, and American soldiers were becoming something entirely new, beings that carried genetic material from multiple species and possessed capabilities that existed nowhere else in human evolutionary history. They had adapted to survive in conditions that should have killed them, but at the cost of everything that had once made them recognizably human. Private George Whitman documented the morning. He realized he could no longer remember his mother's name, but could identify the emotional state of every rat in his section of trench simply by listening to their breathing patterns. He had become fluent in languages that existed nowhere else on Earth, communication systems that blended human intelligence with animal instinct in ways that defied every principle of natural evolution. The war would eventually end, but the transformation it had created would continue for generations. These men had crossed evolutionary boundaries that separated species, becoming living bridges between human civilization and animal survival instincts. They carried within themselves the genetic memory of humanity's descent into its most primitive state, along with adaptations that might prove essential for survival in a world that was rapidly forgetting what it meant to be human. The spring offensive was approaching, and with it would come new tests of their ability to function as both soldiers and the hybrid creatures they had become. The generals sitting in comfortable headquarters had no idea that the men they were ordering into battle were no longer entirely human, that the war had created a new species of fighter that possessed capabilities beyond anything military strategists had ever imagined. The mud was beginning to dry, revealing landscapes that had been hidden beneath winter's frozen cover. What emerged was a geography of death and adaptation, a terrain that had been shaped by the interaction between human technology and animal survival instincts. The rats had built cities in this underground kingdom, complex networks of tunnels and chambers that rivaled human engineering achievements. The soldiers who had learned to navigate this labyrinth had developed spatial awareness and movement patterns that more closely resembled their rodent neighbours than their former human selves. Corporal James Anderson wrote his final letter home, though he could no longer remember the address or even the country where his family lived. He had become a citizen of the underground world, a resident of trenches that existed in no official geography, but had become more real to him than any surface location he had ever known. His loyalty was no longer to king or country, but to the survival of creatures like himself, beings who had learned to